History in an Hour. Black History by Rupert Coliens. Read by Jonathan Keeble. Introduction. This e-book cannot by definition be comprehensive. Even as a summary, there is much that has to be excluded, and such exclusions are naturally subjective. However, this book aims to provide the reader with an introduction to the powerful and dramatic history that is loosely termed Black History. The study of black history in the West has to be seen primarily in the context of American history. It was in the USA, where all men are created equal, that slavery and the fight for civil rights had its most profound effect. Freedom and the rights of the individual formed the basis of the Declaration of Independence. But Thomas Jefferson, the composer of the Declaration, was himself an owner of slaves, 200 of them at any one time, and 600 over the course of his life. George Washington, the first President of the United States, likewise owned slaves, as did most of his immediate successors. The 13 British colonies of North America that had fought for and won their freedom in 1776 had felt enslaved by the British, but saw no contradiction that at the point of independence no less than 18% of their number were slaves. The anti-slavery voice of the northern states grew stronger, and in 1780 Pennsylvania became the first state to abolish slavery within its borders. More northern states were to follow, but the Southerners, dependent as they were on slavery, held their position. So polarized were the North and South, so divided on this one central fundamental issue, that the country went to war with itself. The result, the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, brought about the end of slavery and the emancipation of America's vast African-American population. But the end of the American Civil War in 1865 and the liberation of the slaves, although a triumph, was merely the end of the first chapter in American black history. Ahead lay a struggle of epic proportions as African Americans fought deep-seated discrimination, violence, and intimidation to assert their political, cultural, and economic identity. A story that for many concluded with the election in 2008 of America's first black president. This, in an hour, is the story of black history. Slavery, the peculiar institution. 17th-century British North America needed labor. Tobacco, rice, and indigo were potentially profitable industries, but the manufacturers lacked the manpower to work the vast fields efficiently. The transatlantic slave trade, already delivering slaves from West Africa to the European colonies in the West Indies, began providing slaves to the New World, the first arriving in Jamestown, Virginia, in 1619. From Senegal, in the northern reaches of West Africa, to Angola in the south, African rulers such as the Yoruba kingdom of Oyo on the Guinea coast and the leaders of Dahomey, modern-day Benin, built successful kingdoms by delivering hordes of their fellow Africans to the European and North American traders. The traders sailed for Africa and bartered with the local African slave merchants, exchanging textiles, armory, luxuries, and alcohol for slaves. The slaves were local criminals, misfits, debtors, or increasingly those randomly kidnapped from neighboring tribes. The journey across the Atlantic lasted several weeks and was a desperate passage. Frightened Africans, torn from home and family, were crammed into the bowels of a ship where overcrowding, lack of ventilation, insufficient nutrition, minimal toilet facilities, and constant seasickness made for appalling conditions. For the white merchants, very aware of how numerically outnumbered they were, mutiny remained a constant fear, necessitating brutal means to keep their cargo in check. Manacled and beaten, the slaves cowered. But it was disease, particularly dysentery, which posed the greatest threat. Once fully at sea, the slaves were allowed time on deck to help minimize the threat. Those showing even the smallest symptom of contamination were immediately thrown overboard. Commercially, it was vital that as many slaves should arrive intact as possible. Once at their destination, the slave faced an uncertain future. Those fortunate to be sold to a good master found themselves in small holdings in the southern colonies of British North America, where lighter work combined with better food and provisions made this the least feared destination. The not-so-fortunate were dispatched to the Caribbean and onto the huge sugar plantations. Many failed to acclimatize to the conditions and the work, and up to 10% died within their first year. Those who did survive this initial period were considered seasoned, in other words, to have adapted to their new conditions and to have successfully made the transition from African to slave. Sugar was the staple commodity of the Caribbean, but the intensity of production impoverished the soil, and the focus of British colonial production shifted to the American colonies. In 1775, the 13 North American colonies broke away from British rule, and, following the American Revolution, became the United States of America. Blacks had served on the American side against the British, fighting alongside white soldiers at several battles. Crispus Attucks, a former slave, had died a martyr's death in 1770, shot by the British whilst fighting in Boston for American independence. But the recruitment of black slaves to the American cause was abruptly stopped when George Washington took command in 1775. The British, however, promised every slave their freedom if they came over to the British or Loyalist side. When America won the war and demanded the return of the black Loyalists, the British refused and helped some 4,000 escape abroad, many to Nova Scotia or to London. Thomas Jefferson, in the draft Declaration of Independence, wanted to speak out against slavery, the peculiar institution, as it was called, but it would have isolated the southern states and weakened the Union from the outset. Unity was more important than the freedom of the slaves, and the anti-slavery clause was quietly dropped. 14 years after independence, the United States conducted its first national census, and found that 757,363, or 19% of the total population, were black. Of these, 697,897, or 92%, were slaves, and 94% of those slaves lived in the southern states. The slave was considered property. They had no civil rights, no rights in the judicial system, no access to education, no say in where or how they lived or worked. They were at the total mercy of their owner. The slave had no more rights than a mule. If an owner whipped or raped a slave, the slave had no recourse to complaint, nor any route to justice. Slavery existed in all 13 southern states, but amongst the northern states a strong anti-slavery voice arose, led in the main by the Quakers, whose opposition was based on moral and religious grounds. In 1780, Pennsylvania, with its strong Quaker influence, became the first state to abolish slavery within its borders, although Vermont, at the time a territory, had abolished slavery 3 years previously. Massachusetts, North Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey followed suit. By 1804, slavery had been banned in every northern state. By 1810, there were over 185,000 free African Americans in the U.S., virtually all in the North. The country, barely a quarter of a century old, was firmly split between the North and the South. The Black Slave, 3/5 the man. If the abolitionists felt that the tide was turning their way, they were dealt a blow in 1787 with the passing of America's Constitution. Congress argued at length as to whether slaves should be granted political rights. The southern states found themselves caught in a dilemma. By constitutionally recognizing the blacks, the inflated population of the southern states would have given them greater representation and hence greater power in Congress. But the downside was if the slaves were recognized as having constitutional rights, then they had to pay tax, which, as they were slaves, their white owners would have to pay on their behalf. The dilemma was solved by a compromise. The black man was given 3/5 the political rights of the white. Thus, enshrined from the beginning, the American Constitution viewed black as inferior to white. The use of slaves towards the end of the 18th century was on the decline until 1793, when Eli Whitney introduced his cotton engine, or cotton gin. By mechanically separating the cotton fibre from the seeds, it revolutionized the manufacturing process of cotton on an industrial scale. Responding to the demands of the expanding textile industry in Great Britain, the farming of cotton expanded across the southern states. In 1790, the South had exported 3,000 bales of cotton. By 1810, with the cotton gin in place, this had increased to 180,000 bales, and half a century later, in 1860, to over 4.5 million bales. But it still needed the manpower to grow and pick the cotton, and so the need for slaves became ever more acute. In Great Britain, black people congregated around the ports attached to the slave trade. In London, by about 1760, between 3 and 6%, or at least 20,000 London residents were black. In 1772, lawyers representing James Somerset, an escaped slave, argued that his subsequent recapture and imprisonment was illegal. Lord Mansfield, presiding over the case, found in favour of Somerset, thereby abolishing slavery within England and Wales. 6 years later, the ruling was extended to Scotland. Mansfield's decision immediately freed about 15,000 slaves, mostly domestic servants, although many, without alternative means, remained with their masters as paid employees. Oluda Equiano, a former slave who had bought his freedom, settled in England, moved in influential circles, and in 1789 published his memoirs. Entitled The Interesting Narratives of the Life of Oluda Equiano, the book and its harsh depictions of Equiano's former life did much to advance the abolitionist cause in England. Following the American Revolution, many black loyalists, the slave soldiers who had fought on the side of the British, arrived in London, further increasing the black population within Britain. In 1786, a special Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor laid plans for the resettlement of blacks to Sierra Leone in West Africa. 400 black poor successfully made the trip, and once there established a colony. The Creole people of Sierra Leone, an ethnic group whose culture is based on Western culture, are descendants of the black poor. But this attempt to restrict the number of blacks in Britain would not last long, and the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century saw another influx of black soldiers and seamen settle in London. In Britain, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade was formed in 1787. It used, among its many forms of agitation, boycotts, petitions, leaflets, and flyers. It would take 20 years, but its efforts were duly rewarded when, in 1807, Parliament passed the Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. British seamen who persisted with the trade were, if caught, liable to a fine of £100 for every slave found aboard ship. The Royal Navy set up a squadron whose task was to patrol the coast of West Africa, capturing ships carrying slaves. Captains on the slave ships, realizing they were about to be caught, would throw slaves overboard to reduce the fines they had to pay. However, within half a century, the Royal Navy had captured 1,600 slave ships and freed 150,000 Africans in the process. Great Britain, having abolished the slave trade in 1807, went further when, in August 1834, it abolished slavery altogether throughout the British Empire. The tireless William Wilberforce had been at the head of the 20-year campaign, and Britain became the third nation, after Denmark and Norway in 1803, to ban the slave trade outright. Slave owners were handsomely compensated, £20 million having been put aside for reparation, and were permitted to retain their former slaves as apprentices for a further 6 years. The former slaves themselves, however, were offered no compensation. On the 1st of January 1808, a year after Britain had abolished the slave trade, the US followed suit. Cuba and Brazil were to continue importing slaves for another half-century. But in Britain and America, at least, the trade had come to an end. But across the Atlantic in America, if the northern states thought the act would ring the death knell for slavery, they were proved wrong. The southern states had already reduced the number of slaves imported from the African continent in the belief that they brought in disease that could infect their existing slaves. Also, the South, by encouraging a greater birth rate, now had a steady supply of new slaves. Many died in infancy, but despite the abolition of the slave trade in 1808, the number of slaves in the U.S. rose from 1 million in 1800 to 4 million in 1860. Slaves accounted for 1/7 of the national population, but made up 1/3 of the population in many of the southern states. Children born to a black mother and a white slave-owning father retained their mother's status, so the South saw an increasing number of mulatto slaves. The act had the unfortunate side effect of rendering the existing slaves that much more valuable. A slave that could be bought for $50 in 1800 cost $1,000 in 1850. The increasing value of slaves also meant that old slaves that may have been retired were made to work longer. In 1822, an organization called the American Colonization Society founded a new colony, Liberia, on the west coast of Africa. Colonized by freed American slaves and declared independent in 1847, Liberia means liberty, and the country's motto is, "The love of liberty brought us here." The flag is a 1-star variation on the Stars and Stripes, and the capital, Monrovia, was named after James Monroe, President of the United States between 1817 and 1825. Liberia, it was felt, offered a safer option for the freed slave than remaining in America, but for many born in the U.S., they preferred to run the gauntlet of discrimination and remain in the nation of their birth. North and South. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Only 1 in 4 Southern families owned a slave, but the whole economy and society was based on slavery, and the fear of insurrection was constant. There are, on record, over 250 known incidences of revolt. Denmark Vesey, a freed slave, spent years planning a huge insurrection and had attracted almost 5,000 African Americans to his cause. But in 1822, Vesey was found out, captured and executed, along with his ringleaders. In 1831, in Virginia, Nat Turner, a slave who had learnt to read and write and who had turned to Christianity, believed that God had ordered him to slay his enemies. A solar eclipse in mid-August 1831 convinced Turner of the necessity and timing, and, on the 21st of August, he killed his master and his master's family. Leading a gang of trusted slaves, Turner led an orgy of killing that lasted 24 hours before troops took control. In retaliation, local whites killed over 100 slaves at random. Turner, having eluded capture until the 30th of October, was tried, convicted, and executed. Laws were subsequently passed to restrict the education of slaves. Many escaped slaves fled to the north, and sometimes on to Canada, via an escape route known as the Underground Railroad. The railroad consisted of a series of safe houses, transport facilities, and guides to help the runaways escape. Between 1830 and 1860, the railroad helped over 3,000 slaves to freedom and safety. Its most famous organizer, Harriet Tubman, pictured above with some rescued slaves, went on to become a Union spy during the Civil War. The population of the U.S. was growing at an incredible rate, from 7.2 million in 1810 to almost 10 million a decade later. By 1860, this had increased threefold to over 30 million, and New York had become the 3rd largest city in the world, behind London and Paris. The increasing birth rate contributed, but it was mainly immigration, particularly from Ireland and Germany, people attracted by the vast tracts of land available in the West, that caused the dramatic rise. Conflicts arose with the native Indians, but the expansion westwards was inevitable. As the white population expanded, newly settled areas or territories asked to be admitted into the Union. To maintain the balance between slave states and free states, territories were admitted 2 at a time. By 1819, the United States was comprised of 22 states, 11 free states from the north and 11 slave states from the south. This informal arrangement became policy following the Missouri Compromise of 1820. In 1820, Missouri petitioned to be admitted into the Union as a slave state, despite its proximity to free states. Senator Henry Clay suggested allowing Missouri in as a slave state, but to maintain the 50-50 ratio to admit Maine as a free state. More significantly, the compromise stated that, with the exception of Missouri, no new state containing slavery would be allowed above the line of 36 degrees 30 minutes. Whilst the southern states tried to paint a paternalistic and benevolent picture of the relationship between master and slave, the anti-slavery movement of the North, inspired by Britain's lead in 1834, continued to press for total abolition. In 1847, Frederick Douglass, a slave who had escaped and won his freedom, began the weekly abolitionist newspaper, the North Star. In May 1851, Sojourner Truth, a freed slave, delivered her influential "Ain't I a Woman" speech at a women's rights convention in Akron, Ohio, in which she compared herself to white women who were accorded respect and asked why the same was not the case for black women. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published the influential Uncle Tom's Cabin, which portrayed, in dramatic fashion, the life of the slave in the American South. But in 1857, the abolitionist cause was dealt a severe blow, following the verdict of the Dred Scott case. Scott, a slave from Missouri, tried to sue his owner on the grounds that he had lived with him in Illinois, a state where slavery had been outlawed. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that blacks were not eligible as U.S. citizens, therefore had no recourse to the U.S. legal system. Furthermore, a slave did not become free merely by entering a free state. A Negro, in short, had no more legal rights than an ass. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th U.S. President, representing the newly formed Republican Party, a party established by the anti-slavery lobby. Lincoln took up his post saying, "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." Lincoln described himself as naturally anti-slavery. "If slavery is not wrong," he wrote in a letter in April 1864, "nothing is wrong." Lincoln's electoral success convinced the South that the days of slavery were numbered. On the 20th of December 1860, South Carolina formally withdrew or seceded from the Union of the United States. Within 7 weeks, 6 more states had seceded, and together they formed the Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederacy, with Jefferson Davis as its president. Once the Civil War had started on the 12th of April 1861, another 4 states followed suit. War and Emancipation. Previous condition of servitude. Slavery may have been the cause of the Civil War, but Lincoln did not go to war specifically for the benefit of the slave. Instead, his paramount objective was to save the Union. "If I could save the Union," he wrote in 1862, "without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." Many slaves fled from their masters, emigrated north, and joined the Union Army. But Lincoln, mindful not to upset the border states between North and South, was initially reluctant to enlist blacks. In late 1862, however, he relented, and through the Militia Act permitted African Americans into the Union Army. In September 1862, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which stated that as from the 1st of January 1863, all slaves in the Confederate States, but not the border states, would be free. Southern slave owners ignored the proclamation, but nonetheless, at the turn of the new year, thousands of slaves fled to the Union, and cities like New York were suddenly overwhelmed with African Americans. Much of the white population in the North resented having to fight for the benefit of blacks, who then engulfed their cities, threatening their livelihoods by offering cheaper labor. As New York and other northern cities descended into race riots, Lincoln prepared to end slavery throughout the country. In his Gettysburg Address in November 1863, Lincoln talked of the need to preserve a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In April 1865, after 4 years of civil war, the Union emerged victorious. At the end of the war, there were 185,000 blacks in the Union Army, and around 20 black soldiers had received the Congressional Medal of Honor. But Lincoln was still concerned that emancipation did not cover the whole nation, and that the former Confederate states might see it as merely a temporary measure of war. Therefore, on the 6th of December 1865, 10 months after its proposal and following the Union's victory, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Slavery, this peculiar institution, had finally been abolished. Lincoln put together a plan to aid the economic and political recovery of the South, and to help the 4 million former slaves as they adapted to their new lives as freed men. In March 1865, during the last weeks of the war, Lincoln had set up an agency, the Freedmen's Bureau, whose purpose was to aid the freed men. The task, once the war was over, was immense. The freed slaves needed, at the most basic level, food, provisions, and shelter, and, for the wounded soldiers, medical supplies. But it was the longer-term objectives that proved so difficult in the immediate post-war years of Reconstruction. The renting of land, access to education, and laying the foundations for the rebuilding of lives. However, on the 14th of April 1865, 5 days after the surrender of the South, Lincoln was shot by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth while attending the theater in Washington, D.C. Lincoln died the following day, aged 56. Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, believed that unity of the Union still took precedence over the welfare of the blacks. He made amends with the former Confederate states, returned them their lands, and permitted the Southern states to pass a set of laws within their own territories, the Black Codes, which aimed to deprive African Americans full citizen rights and restrict their economic freedom. In response, a group of Northern politicians, known collectively as the Radical Republicans, tried to protect the rights of blacks, advocating that the powers of the federal government, through Congress, should override that of the individual states. In April 1866, the Radical Republicans pushed the Civil Rights Act, a number of laws protecting the rights of African Americans through Congress. 2 months later, despite opposition from President Johnson, they proposed the 14th Amendment, which defined American citizenship to include African Americans and gave them the vote. But a draft amendment could only be accepted if approved by 3/4 of the states. Of the Southern states, only Tennessee ratified the proposal. Congress retaliated by introducing the Reconstruction Act, whereby the Southern states, except Tennessee, were divided into 5 districts and placed under martial law. Normal constitutional rights would be reinstated once they had each ratified the amendment. It took 2 years, but finally, on the 9th of July, 1868, the 14th Amendment came into being. African Americans were now recognized as American citizens. In May 1868, the Radical Republicans attempted to impeach President Johnson for his obstructionist actions against Reconstruction. Needing a 2/3 majority in Congress to succeed, they failed by 1 vote. However, Johnson agreed henceforth not to block Reconstruction. But 6 months later, Johnson was voted out. In the 1868 presidential election, Ulysses S. Grant, the former Union Army general and now Republican candidate, gained 450,000 black votes and won by 300,000 votes. The black vote had made the difference. However, whilst every southern state had been coerced into granting blacks the vote, there were still northern states that resisted. The 15th Amendment, ratified in March 1870, required every state to legally recognize the black vote, that no citizen could be denied the vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Grant's time in office was the most hopeful period in the Reconstruction era. The black codes were removed, and many southern states, now run by Republicans, saw African Americans take to politics, many migrating south from the northern states. Cynical Southerners called them carpetbaggers because they arrived from the north with so few possessions that what they had could fit into one small carpetbag. Much of the land taken from the whites after the Civil War was returned to them, and many Southern African Americans found themselves working for their former slave owners, being paid wages, but at a pitiful rate. And with white resentment came terrorism, and, in particular, the formation of the feared Ku Klux Klan. Founded in 1865, the KKK murdered, lynched, and whipped the Southern blacks, burnt down their homes, and at times of elections intimidated the black vote into virtual silence. In 1877, Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes promised, if elected, to rid the South of federal troops and allow states more say in how they govern themselves. Whites, rich and poor, united behind the Republican Party. Hayes's consequent victory signaled the end of black hopes, and now, with the states able to assert their own rights and controlled entirely by resentful whites, the progress made under Reconstruction was about to be reversed. The Jim Crow era. Separate but equal. In 1883, the U.S. Supreme Court repealed the Civil Rights Act. The southern states, benefiting from states' rights, began altering voting regulations. Mississippi led the way, stating that to be eligible to vote, citizens had to be paying the poll tax, pass a literacy test, or own property. All these requirements effectively excluded African Americans. Many southern states followed Mississippi's stance, stating that if one's grandfather had voted, then one was exempt from these requirements. But all black grandfathers would have been slaves, and so would have been denied the vote. The southern states, and, to a lesser degree the northern states too, became racially segregated societies, sanctioned by state laws that reaffirmed the inferiority of the blacks. These racially divisive laws were collectively known as the Jim Crow laws, after a song and dance routine in a minstrel show. All aspects of public life were segregated, and were to remain so for decades to come. From the cradle, birth clinics, schools, playgrounds, to the grave, churches, cemeteries, and everything in between, restaurants, shops, post offices, blood banks, hospitals, gas stations, hotels, taxis, laundrettes, even drinking fountains, life was segregated between whites only and blacks only. In 1896, the Supreme Court endorsed this segregation in the Plessy v. Ferguson case. Homer Plessy, a black man, contested Louisiana Railroad's instruction that he must sit in a separate carriage. It was, Plessy argued, a violation of his constitutional rights. The Supreme Court disagreed. As long as the separate facilities offered were equal, then a violation had not taken place. Thus, legally equal, though in practice not, the Jim Crow laws were sanctioned, and racial segregation became a feature of American life. Black people tried to protest, invariably in vain. Booker T. Washington, an influential black spokesman, believed that recognition and success started with education. In 1881, he became the first head of the newly opened Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in Alabama, established specifically for black students. And in 1900 he founded the National Negro Business League. Speaking at the opening of the Atlanta World Fair in 1895, an event which in itself was a huge leap in recognition of black endeavor, Washington argued that black people were wasting their energies trying to resist segregation. In what became known as the Atlanta Compromise, it was better, he maintained, that black people educated themselves in vocational or practical subjects and worked hard. Only through hard work and peaceful means, Washington believed, would they eventually win both respect and equality, a theme he espoused further in his influential autobiography, Up from Slavery. Washington advised a succession of U.S. presidents, but his influence only went so far. President Theodore Roosevelt, in a speech to Congress in 1906, stated that while black men continued to rape white women, lynching was perfectly justifiable. Roosevelt's successor in the White House, Woodrow Wilson, the first Southerner to be elected president since the Civil War, sidelined Washington and wore his racist roots with pride. An admirer of the Ku Klux Klan, Wilson was proud of the South's history, including its involvement in slavery. Washington's philosophy was simply too accommodating for many. W.E.B. Du Bois, the first African-American to gain a doctorate from Harvard, believed education should do more than merely teach vocational trades. It should teach black people how to live assertively, fighting for equality and demanding of their civil rights. In 1905, Du Bois and a group of 28 other African Americans met in Ontario, Canada, near the Niagara Falls, and wrote a manifesto demanding an end to racial discrimination and recognition of full civil liberties for blacks. Initially called the Niagara Movement, it evolved 4 years later into the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. It challenged through the courts a number of segregation cases and lobbied on behalf of blacks. One of its primary aims was to put a stop to the practice of lynching. Between the mid-1880s and 1914, there were 7,500 known cases of lynching. Although the NAACP and its journal The Crisis, edited by Du Bois until 1934, expanded in both membership and influence and improved educational opportunities for blacks, the lynching continued. After keeping statistics for 71 years, the Tuskegee Institute reported that 1952 was the first year they had received no recorded cases of lynching. War, Migration and Depression. Black is beautiful. During the First World War, Britain saw one of the first large migrations of blacks, when over 15,000 arrived in northwest England from the Caribbean, mainly to work in the munitions factories. The large influx resulted in a series of race riots across several cities during 1919. Walter Tull, the grandson of slaves and a successful footballer in Britain during the pre-war years, had become the first black officer in the British Army and the first to lead white troops into battle. He was killed in action during the last Battle of the Somme in 1918, aged 29. Black soldiers also fought for the U.S. Army during the First World War, many serving as officers. But blacks were barred from joining the Marines and were forbidden to become officers in the U.S. Navy. Black soldiers fighting in France saw firsthand the sense of equality in Europe, whilst their white colleagues warned French soldiers to mind their women, lest the black soldiers should rape them. Unbeknown to most, it was a black scientist, Garrett A. Morgan from Ohio, who had invented the prototype for the gas mask that became such a vital part of the frontline soldiers' equipment. In the U.S. during the war, African Americans moved en masse from the rural South to the cities of the North, West, and Midwest. They found work in factories producing supplies and armaments for war, but faced discrimination and violence at every turn. In July 1917, following racist violence in East St. Louis in Illinois, Du Bois' NAACP staged a silent march in New York. With the men dressed in black and women and children in white, they marched silently, but for the sound of muffled drums, bearing banners that read, "Mr. President, why not make America safe for democracy?" President Woodrow Wilson may have promised that the war would make the world safe for democracy, but when the black soldiers returned home, the lynching continued, with many recorded cases of black soldiers lynched while still wearing their uniforms. The power of the individual states continued to take precedence over federal power, and without a federal police force in place, the blacks were always vulnerable. Nothing, it seemed, had improved. The Great Migration North continued after the war, with some 5 million African Americans moving. Chicago, which saw a huge influx of black labor, suffered riots during the so-called Red Summer of 1919. The riots were sparked off when a black boy was seen swimming in an area reserved for whites. The boy was stoned for his error and drowned. The local blacks responded with violence, and the situation escalated into a riot that lasted 13 days, resulting in 38 fatalities and much devastation throughout the city. It was only one of 25 U.S. cities that suffered post-war racial rioting. New York's black population doubled during the 1920s, and such was the concentration of blacks in the area of Harlem that it resulted in a surge of creative output referred to as the Harlem Renaissance. One such Harlem resident was Marcus Garvey. Born in Jamaica in 1887, Marcus Garvey came to the United States in 1916 and brought with him the organization he had founded in Jamaica, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Based in Harlem, the self-styled Black Moses declared that black is beautiful. But his doctrine of separatism put him at odds with other black leaders, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, who found Garvey's approach overly brash. Garvey launched the Back to Africa campaign, declaring himself the president of the Empire of Africa, despite never having set foot on the continent. Garvey's downfall resulted from one of his many dubious business practices, and only the intervention of President Calvin Coolidge, who commuted Garvey's sentence after 2 years in jail, saved him from a further 3 years. Nonetheless, Garvey was deported back to Jamaica. He died in 1940 in London. Although Garvey's Back to Africa may have failed, his flamboyance and sense of black consciousness did much to further the black cause in the U.S. The Great Depression of the 1930s hit all of America. Whites, desperate for work, took on jobs previously held only by blacks and joined forces to keep blacks out of the workplace. President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced the New Deal, a series of packages to help counter the Depression, with programs such as the Civilian Conservation Corps, which did much for conservation and road building, and the National Youth Association, which helped thousands of black workers find employment. It also brought about a political change. The black vote, always associated with the Republican Party, now shifted to Roosevelt's Democrats. In April 1931, 9 black boys, aged from 12 to 19, were accused by 2 white girls of multiple rape whilst on a train near Scottsboro in Alabama. With scant evidence against them, and with a defense team cobbled together on the day of the trial, a white jury found all 9 guilty. The nation was outraged, and after a series of retrials and interventions by the U.S. Supreme Court, all 9 were finally freed, the last being released in 1946. The era of Jim Crow was still very much alive, and despite the moral indignations of many, the nation still existed as a segregated society. Lynching may have decreased, but it still continued, and extreme racism and racist violence was still part of the Southern landscape, especially in the states of Alabama and Mississippi. In the realm of sport, however, African Americans, and America as a whole, had reason to cheer. In 1936, at the Berlin Olympics, in front of Hitler, Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals. The following year, the Brown Bomber, boxer Joe Louis, became the first black world heavyweight boxing champion, a momentous feat and occasion for the generation of pre-war African Americans. War and Windrush to secure these rights. The United States fought the Second World War for the ideals of freedom, democracy, and equality. But back home the population lived segregated lives. Equality was nothing but a pipe dream, and in the southern states most blacks were still without the vote. Yet over 1 million African Americans fought for America during the Second World War, in an army and navy that was still segregated. 708 were killed in combat. In the immediate post-war years, President Harry S. Truman did much to advance equality, particularly in his efforts to end discrimination in the armed forces and civil service. Truman appointed a committee to review civil rights, and its report a year later, To Secure These Rights, insisted that the abolition of segregation was the only means by which to achieve civil rights and equality. In July 1948, all U.S. armed forces were finally desegregated. Truman's commitment to equality often ran contrary to factions within his own party and the white majority in the South. But he believed that if the U.S. was to lead the free world in the fight against tyranny, then it had to show that all Americans, no matter what their race, had access to freedom and equality. The post-war years saw further African-American achievements. Gwendolyn Brooks won the Pulitzer Prize, the first black person to do so. Ralph Bunche won the Nobel Peace Prize for his mediatory role in Palestine. And Jackie Robinson became the first black player to play top-flight baseball, enduring much discrimination from players and fans alike. In Britain, during the post-war years, the government, in an attempt to replenish the labour market after the losses sustained during the war, encouraged mass immigration from the countries of the Empire and the Commonwealth. The 1948 British Nationality Act gave British citizenship to all people living in Commonwealth countries and full rights of entry and settlement in Britain. As a result, on the 24th of May 1948, 492 passengers, paying £28.10 each, plus 6 stowaways, set sail from Jamaica on the Empire Windrush, and 4 weeks later, on the 22nd of June, arrived at Tilbury Docks near London. Motivated by the sense of adventure and the lack of opportunity at home, their arrival in the mother country marked the beginning of modern-day mass immigration. Within a decade, over 250,000 West Indians, mainly Jamaicans, had settled in Britain. Working in hospitals and the transport and railway industries, the West Indian contribution helped rebuild the economy and infrastructure of post-war Britain. But they found much antagonism and discrimination. Racism, resentment, and cultural misunderstanding led to many clashes between the white and black communities. The influx of immigration became so acute that in 1962 Britain passed the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, restricting the number of immigrants. 10 years later, only those with parents or grandparents born in the UK could enter. But after a quarter of a century of immigration, there already existed in Britain an entire generation of African-Caribbean migrants. The Civil Rights Movement 1. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. In May 1954, following the Brown v. the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation of public schools was unconstitutional. Oliver Brown, a father of a school-aged child, challenged the law that stated he had to send his daughter to an all-black school much further away than the local all-white school. The Supreme Court agreed and concluded, "In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place," referring to and overturning the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case. But with no fixed timetable, and with the southern states in no hurry to implement the ruling, the court was obliged to follow up a year later with an order that schools must integrate with all deliberate speed. School buses transported school children considerable distances to ensure integration, and 15 years later, in 1969, the Supreme Court had to intervene again when many schools had still to desegregate. In August 1955, a 14-year-old black boy, Emmett Till, was mutilated and murdered by white racists in Mississippi. His crime? Disrespecting a white woman. His killers were controversially found not guilty by a white jury. Later, safe from retrial on the double jeopardy ruling, the killers admitted their guilt and sold their stories to the press, much to national outrage. On the 1st of December 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, 42-year-old Rosa Parks, seated in a segregated bus, refused to give up her seat to a white man. The bus driver called the police, and Parks was arrested. Parks was the local secretary of the NAACP, and the branch had been looking for an opportunity to stage a boycott of the city's buses. The opportunity now presented itself, and the boycott duly started on the 5th of December. The Montgomery boycott was led by a 26-year-old recently appointed Baptist reverend by the name of Martin Luther King, Jr. Lasting a year, the boycott caused much hardship and inconvenience, but eventually the city's buses, so reliant on its black customers, relented. In November 1956, the Supreme Court declared segregation on public transport to be illegal, and a month later, on the 21st of December, stepping on board the first non-segregated bus in Montgomery was the Reverend King. Inspired by the non-confrontational approach adopted by Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Jr. spoke for the rising black consciousness of 1950s America. "The objective," said King, "was not to coerce, but to correct. Not to break bodies or wills, but to move hearts." In September 1957, 9 black students tried to enroll at the recently desegregated Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. The state governor ordered in the Arkansas National Guard to keep them out. Finally, after 3 weeks of picketing and escalating tensions, President Eisenhower dispatched federal troops to escort the Little Rock Nine to class. Televised throughout America, it showed the stark reality of racial injustice still prevalent within the country's borders. However, Eisenhower's attitude toward civil rights was lukewarm at best, and 1 month before the 1960 presidential election, it was his Democratic opponent who stole the lead on civil rights. During a sit-in in Atlanta, King was arrested and sentenced to 4 months' hard labor. It was John F. Kennedy who rang King's wife, and his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, who pulled the strings and had King's sentence reversed, not Eisenhower. With the black vote now in his favor, Kennedy went on to win the election of November 1960. Black students throughout the South extended their non-violent protests by organizing further sit-ins. In February 1960, 4 students in Greensboro, North Carolina, were denied service in a segregated diner. Refusing to leave, they were threatened and insulted, but, determined they should be served, they returned the following day, and again throughout the week. Students, both black and white, joined their protest, prepared to sit in dignified silence whilst mobs jeered, poked, and smeared ketchup and mustard in their hair. But the protests continued, rapidly spreading across the South, affecting restaurants, hotels, shops, libraries, beaches, and most public facilities. Television cameras tracked the story as the tension escalated, and families throughout America and abroad watched with horror the unfolding indignities and intimidation happening in the land of the free. In 1962, Kennedy had to order troops to assist James Meredith, a young black man, enroll at the University of Mississippi. In September, the governor of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, physically blocked Meredith's entrance to the university. The following month, Meredith tried again, this time with the aid of Kennedy's federal enforcement. The ensuing riots saw 2 killed and over 160 injured. Meredith finally took his place, and, having suffered a year of racism and intimidation, graduated in August 1963 with a degree in political science. Whilst state-run segregated buses had been declared illegal, interstate bus facilities remained segregated. In May 1961, protesters embarked on the Freedom Rides organised by the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. They were met with civil disturbances and violence throughout the South, as white mobs attacked the buses. In Montgomery, the governor of Alabama refused to send the state guard to protect the passengers, and Robert F. Kennedy had to order in federal troops to break up the increasingly violent scenes. But finally, effective from the 1st of November 1961, interstate bus services were desegregated. In May 1963, Birmingham, Alabama saw a major protest against the city's segregation policies. The city's police used dogs and fire hoses against the peaceful demonstrators, which included women and children. Nearly 3,000 people were arrested, amongst them King, his 13th arrest. From his cell, King used scrap pieces of paper and margins of newspapers to write a 7,000-word open letter on the moral issues of the civil rights movement. Known as the Letter from Birmingham Jail, it included the line, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." On the 11th of June 1963, President Kennedy spoke on national television about the need for civil rights. "Legislation cannot solve this problem alone. It must be solved in the home of every American." Within a few days, Kennedy had presented Congress with a sweeping raft of civil rights legislation, which, despite its moral necessity, required greater federal power at the expense of state power. It was perhaps asking too much. Civil rights leaders, realizing the potential for its failure, decided, against Kennedy's advice, to organize a huge demonstration to pressurize Congress into passing the bill. On the 28th of August 1963, 250,000 people took part in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. On the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, folk singer Joan Baez led the crowd in the song that had become the anthem of the civil rights movement, "We Shall Overcome," and Bob Dylan sang "Blowin' in the Wind." The marchers, black and white, young and old, rich and poor, a complete cross-section of society, listened as Martin Luther King proclaimed, "I have a dream. I have a dream that one day, on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at a table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." A mere month later, in Birmingham, Alabama, 4 white supremacists detonated a bomb at a Baptist church popular with African Americans. 20 people were injured in the explosion, and 4 young girls, aged 11 to 14, were tragically killed. After a series of bungled investigations into the Birmingham church bombing involving blocked evidence and malpractices, the last of the 4 killers was finally convicted in 2002. It had taken almost 4 decades for justice to be done. On the 22nd of November, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson, appointed his successor, prioritized the Civil Rights Bill, which was passed on the 2nd of July, 1964. Segregation in public facilities was now illegal, as was to discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, or country of origin. The Civil Rights Movement, too. Burn, burn, burn. Whilst the ending of segregation was a huge achievement, the southern states still managed through intimidation and violence to deny black people the vote and education. The civil rights movement had reinvigorated the Ku Klux Klan, especially in Mississippi, the poorest of the southern states. During the summer of 1964, CORE targeted Mississippi in a campaign to increase the number of black people registered to vote and to help run freedom schools. Attracting almost 1,000 volunteers, black and white, they were met with violence and intimidation, culminating in the disappearance of 3 friends, 2 white youths and their black companion. When their bodies were found 6 weeks later in the Mississippi, their murders caused a national outrage. On the 7th of March 1965, King, who had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize the previous year, its youngest recipient at that point, led 600 demonstrators on an 80-kilometer march from the Alabama town of Selma to the state capital of Montgomery, its objective to highlight the issue of black voting. But Alabaman police, mounted on horseback and armed with clubs and tear gas, attacked the marchers. Televised across America, the nation had again reason to feel sickened by the actions of its fellow countrymen. President Johnson, describing it as an American tragedy, placed the Alabama National Guard under federal control and ordered it to protect the demonstration. King led 2,500 people in a second, much shorter march 2 days later. The full march onto Montgomery recommenced on the 21st of March, and on reaching its destination 5 days later and following King's emotional speech, the demonstrators sang the civil rights anthem, "We Shall Overcome," the words modified to, "We Have Overcome." 5 months later, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. The unscrupulous practices that had prevented African Americans from voting, such as literacy tests and poll taxes, were banned. In signing the bill, President Johnson invited King to witness the momentous occasion. Also present was Rosa Parks, a decade on from her famous boycott of the Montgomery bus service. King's non-confrontational movement had achieved much in terms of political and legislative equality, but what it had not achieved was economic equality. In employment, blacks were twice as likely to be unemployed than whites. Black poverty, as a percentage of the black population, was far higher than white poverty. In housing, white neighborhoods, fearing that black integration would adversely affect house prices, refused to sell to blacks. In 1966, King led a march in Chicago against housing discrimination, but the marchers were pelted with stones, and the protest saw the beginning of the white backlash. Although in 1968 a law ending housing discrimination was introduced, it was hard to implement, whilst estate agents, banks, and home insurance companies refused to do business with black home buyers. In August 1965, in the Watts area of Los Angeles, an area populated by poor blacks, a white policeman drew his gun while arresting a young black man for driving offences. It triggered a 6-day riot that saw 34 die and thousands arrested. Whilst President Johnson launched his unconditional war on poverty, summer riots became disturbingly familiar throughout northern cities during the mid-1960s, as young, impoverished blacks rejected King's non-confrontational approach and fought running battles with police. Johnson's Great Society had passed them by. Economic dissatisfaction, frustration with the lack of progress in Johnson's reforms, and the lack of hope certainly played its part, as did the total lack of black policemen. The police force was seen by the black population as the enemy, an instrument of the state. Black youths were beginning to reject King's non-confrontational approach and were increasingly attracted by more radical leaders, such as the charismatic Malcolm X. Born Malcolm Little, Malcolm spent time in prison, where he converted to Islam, ditched his slave name for X, and joined the Nation of Islam, a group founded by Elijah Muhammad, in which the black Muslims rejected Christianity as a white man's religion and preached separation of the races. In 1964, Malcolm split from the black Muslims, reputedly ousted for saying that the assassination of President Kennedy was a case of chickens coming to roost, and formed his own radical group, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, preaching black nationalism and advocating the use of violence, if necessary, to achieve it. Malcolm and Martin Luther King met but once, in March 1964. On the 21st of February 1965, Malcolm was assassinated by, it is presumed, one of Elijah Muhammad's followers. Black Power.
We gonna stop them white men from whooping us.
The sit-ins of the early 1960s had inspired the formation of the SNCC, the Student Non-Violent Coordinating Committee, which, as the name suggests, organized peaceful interracial demonstrations. But as the decade progressed, many within the SNCC questioned how long it could maintain its pledge of non-violence. In 1966, the same year as the formation of the Black Panthers, Stokely Carmichael took charge of the SNCC and began advocating the use of violence as a means of self-defense. Within a month of taking over, Carmichael had removed all whites working or volunteering for the SNCC and denounced all past white benefactors. Black militancy alienated much white support. The TV images of black youths chanting, "Burn, burn, burn," frightened white sympathizers. 95% of CORE's financial intake came from white donations, but in 1966, swept along by black militancy, the organization, following the SNCC's lead, expelled all its white members and their contributions. On the 5th of June 1966, James Meredith, the student who, in 1962, had managed eventually to enroll at the University of Mississippi, began a solitary 220-mile march against fear from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi, as a protest against racism. But Meredith was shot and injured. His cause was taken up by other civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael of the SNCC. On the 25th of June, Meredith was able to rejoin the march, and the following day, 3 weeks after he had set out alone, 15,000 marchers arrived at Jackson. Along the way, they had been attacked by white mobs and tear-gassed by the police, as well as being entertained by the singer James Brown. It was during the March Against Fear that Carmichael delivered his Black Power speech.
"This is the 27th time I've been arrested, and I ain't going to jail no more. The only way we're going to stop them white men from whooping us is to take over. What we're going to start saying now is Black Power."
Although they marched side by side, the increasing radicalism of Carmichael's SNCC was at odds with King's determined non-confrontational approach. In June 1967, Carmichael was replaced by H. Rap Brown as the leader of the SNCC. By removing the word non-violent from the title, Brown renamed the group the Student National Coordinating Committee and advocated the use of violence, which he described as American as cherry pie. "Don't love the white man to death," remarked Brown. "Shoot him to death." Having left the SNCC, Carmichael joined the Black Panthers. The group had emerged in 1966, advocating violent revolt and the use of firearms. "Black is beautiful" became their slogan, rejecting white values and celebrating Afro hairstyles and African forms of dress. Often confrontational and antagonistic in nature, Black Power brought black politics and culture to the forefront of America's consciousness. The FBI's director, J. Edgar Hoover, called the Panthers the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. During the early 1970s, the FBI marginalized the Panthers until they became increasingly split and eventually lost all influence. In 1967, the first African-American mayors of major U.S. cities, Cleveland, Ohio, and Gary, Indiana, were elected, Carl Stokes and Richard Hatcher. In June 1967, President Johnson appointed Thurgood Marshall as the first African-American to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. Marshall had previously found fame in the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case. 9 years previously, in 1958, a black woman and a white man, residents of Virginia, got married in the District of Columbia, where interracial marriage was legal. On their return to Virginia, where such marriages were banned, Mr. and Mrs. Loving, as they were appropriately called, were sentenced to 1 year in jail, suspended on condition that they leave Virginia and not return for 25 years. The judge stated that God
did not intend for the races to mix.
Interracial unions were banned in 16 states until the Lovings successfully took their case to the Supreme Court, which, in June 1967, concluded that the banning of such unions was unconstitutional. Also in 1967, King founded the Poor People's Campaign in order to put pressure on the government to do more to combat poverty. President Johnson's War on Poverty initiative had faltered as the demands of the escalating Vietnam War diverted both his attention and resources. Johnson struggled as he tried to juggle the war, the anti-war lobby, the civil rights movement, and the powerful white backlash. In March 1968, Johnson, increasingly unpopular and unable to find a way out of Vietnam without America losing face, declared he wouldn't be standing for re-election later that year. 4 days after Johnson's announcement, James Earl Ray, a white supremacist, shot and killed the 39-year-old Martin Luther King on the 4th of April in Memphis, Tennessee. The assassination triggered riots in over 100 American cities, resulting in 50 deaths and thousands of arrests. On the eve of his death, King had said, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the Promised Land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the Promised Land." 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy, brother to John F. Kennedy and champion of the civil rights movement, was also assassinated. The Democratic Party met in Chicago in August 1968 to choose its nominee for the presidency following Kennedy's assassination. But the convention ended in fiasco as police beat up civil rights and anti-war demonstrators. The sorry affair televised throughout the nation. In the Mexico Olympics of October 1968, Tommy Smith won the 200 meters, beating the then world record. Standing on the podium along with bronze medal winner and fellow African-American John Carlos, the two men raised their fists in the Black Power salute. Criticized by many for politicizing the Games and applauded by others for highlighting the plight of African Americans in the U.S., their gesture remains an iconic image in the history of the Olympic Games. The 1970s saw the rise of African Americans as global icons. Muhammad Ali, Jimi Hendrix, Michael Jackson, Aretha Franklin, and Arthur Ashe. In 1970, Maya Angelou published I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and 6 years later, Alex Haley published his seminal novel Roots, the Saga of an American Family, which was adapted for television the following year. But for many, the civil rights movement died in 1968 with the death of Martin Luther King and the election of Richard Nixon. Black Power remained a force until the early 1970s, when internal disagreement and factions and the pressure asserted by the FBI ensured its demise. Britain and South Africa. Rivers of Blood. In Britain, in April 1968, Enoch Powell, Member of Parliament for the Conservative Party, who 20 years before had led a recruitment drive in Jamaica to encourage nurses to work in Britain, delivered his Rivers of Blood speech, in which he talked in apocalyptic terms about the seemingly unending tide of immigration coming into Britain from the Commonwealth. He compared Britain's future with what was happening at the time in the US. "That tragic and intractable phenomenon which we watch with horror on the other side of the Atlantic is coming upon us here by our own volition and our own neglect. Only resolute and urgent action will avert it even now." The following day, Powell was sacked as Conservative Shadow Defence Secretary, but his speech roused much support, and he reputedly received nearly 50,000 letters of support. In 1976, Britain passed the Race Relations Act, which rendered racial discrimination unlawful in employment, training, housing, education, and the provision of goods, facilities, and services. But the early 1980s saw the era of the race riots, starting in Bristol in 1980, ostensibly as a reaction to the police sus laws, a ruling that enabled police officers to stop and question anyone based on nothing more than suspicion, which, in practice, targeted black youths. There had been race riots before, going back to Notting Hill in London in 1948, but never as concentrated as this. As the riots spread through several British cities during the summer of 1981, it broadened into a general protest against black unemployment, poor housing, poverty, and discrimination, with much of the tension targeted at the police as symbols of white authority. But 6 years later, in 1987, Britain elected its first 3 black members of Parliament: Diane Abbott, Paul Boateng, and Bernie Grant. Then, on the 11th of February 1990, Nelson Mandela was released from prison. South Africa had gained its independence from Britain 80 years before, in 1910, but political power was granted only to whites. In 1948, in a whites-only election, the Afrikaner-led National Party came to power and began a policy of segregation known as apartheid, from the Afrikaans word for separateness. The Population Registration Act of 1950 classified all South Africans as white, the descendants of the Boers or British, Bantu, black Africans, coloured, mixed race, or Asian, Indian and Pakistani immigrants. The Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1948 forbade marriages between the races, and with the Immorality Act of 1950, it became illegal even to show an interest in a member of a different race. The Group Areas Act 1950 established separate areas for each race, and the mixing of races to live, work, or own land was forbidden, which meant, in effect, areas of greater wealth and development were restricted to whites. The Pass Laws Act of 1952 restricted movement by making it obligatory for all black South Africans over the age of 16 to carry a pass book. Similar to a passport, white employers could write a character reference, good or bad, about the cardholder. Non-whites, needing to venture beyond their immediate confines, had to seek permission, which, if granted, was entered on their pass. To be found in a white area without valid permission could result in imprisonment. An organised protest by the Pan-African Congress, PAC, against the pass laws in the township of Sharpeville on the 21st of March 1960 resulted in tragedy when police opened fire and killed 69 black protesters. The incident, known as the Sharpeville Massacre, earned South Africa condemnation from the United Nations, and the following year, in 1961, expulsion from the Commonwealth, the alliance of former British colonies. Within South Africa, both the PAC and its rival organisation, the African National Congress, the ANC, founded in 1912, were banned. The ANC, deciding that non-violent protests would not work in South Africa, launched a campaign of sabotage and aggression through its military arm, the Umkhonto weSizwe, Spear of the Nation, which had, as its first leader, Nelson Mandela. Arrested for sabotage in 1962, Mandela and other ANC leaders were sentenced to life imprisonment and incarcerated on the infamous Robben Island. In 1976, in Soweto, police fired on unarmed protesters, killing hundreds, earning the South African regime further condemnation throughout the world. The following year, Steve Biko, a leading black leader, was murdered whilst in police custody. During the 1980s, as tension escalated, blacks who were suspected of working with the white rulers risked being summarily executed by necklacing, the practice where a tire filled with petrol was placed over the victim's head and set alight. The ANC, which always maintained communist leanings, received financial backing from the Soviet Union, while many in the West saw apartheid as an ally against communism. But after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990, and with increasing international pressure, South Africa and its president, F.W. de Klerk, finally relented and, on the 2nd of February 1990, lifted the ban on the ANC, and 9 days later, on the 11th of February, released Mandela from prison after 27 years of incarceration. Violence and the threat of violence in the immediate post-apartheid years remained a constant, especially following the assassination in April 1993 of ANC leader Chris Hani. In a televised broadcast, Mandela appealed for calm, and the country pulled back from the brink of disaster. In 1993, both Mandela and de Klerk were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for the peaceful termination of the apartheid regime and for laying the foundations for a new democratic South Africa. That new democratic South Africa came into being on the 27th of April 1994, with the first free and multiracial elections in South Africa's history. Mandela, as leader of the ANC, was elected as South Africa's first black president, and de Klerk, representing the National Party, was appointed his first deputy. 40 years later, because of the colour of her skin. 1968 had been one of America's darkest years. The assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy, and the police brutality at the Democratic Convention. But 40 years later, the U.S. elected its first African-American president, Barack Obama, born in 1961 to a white mother and a black father. Obama's victory speech on the 4th of November 2008 took place in his hometown of Chicago in Grant Park, scene of much of the fighting during the Democratic Party convention of 1968. In his speech, he referred to 106-year-old Chicago resident Ann Nixon Cooper, one-time civil rights activist and friend of W.E.B. Du Bois. She was born just a generation past slavery, a time when there were no cars on the road or planes in the sky, when someone like her couldn't vote for two reasons: because she was a woman and because of the color of her skin. Mrs. Cooper died on the 21st of December 2009, but she had lived just long enough. That was History in an Hour, Black History.